Deep in the Virginia State Archives, buried beneath decades of administrative records, lies a collection of documents that authorities tried desperately to suppress for over 2 centuries. 23 witness testimonies, 14 coroner reports describing death so brutal they defied explanation, and 1 blood-stained journal belonging to a woman whose very name became synonymous with terror throughout Henrio County. The year was 1801. And Kate Bender had just begun what locals would whisper about as the hunting season that never ended. Oh, what makes these documents particularly disturbing is not just their graphic detail, but the methodical precision with which they document a reign of terror that claimed the lives of at least 37 escaped slaves in the span of 18 months. Even more chilling is how close these atrocities came to remaining completely hidden from history. Before we continue with the story of Kate Bender and the horrors that unfolded in the forests of Henrio County, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the darkest, most meticulously researched historical mysteries that others are afraid to tell. If you're brave enough to hear stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our content. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know what state or city you're in. Now, let's step into the shadows of 1801 Virginia, where a woman's thirst for vengeance would transform her into something far more terrifying than any monster from folklore. The discovery of these documents in 1987 sent shockwaves through academic circles, but their contents were deemed too sensitive for public release. What you're about to hear has been compiled from those sealed records, survivor accounts, and court testimonies that paint a picture of evil so methodical and brutal that it challenges everything we thought we knew about the Underground Railroad era. Richmond, Virginia in the year 1801 was a city balanced precariously on the edge of upheaval. The failed rebellion of Gabriel Prosser the previous summer had left the entire region in a state of paranoid tension, with plantation owners sleeping with loaded muskets beside their beds and slaves disappearing into the night at unprecedented rates. It was in this atmosphere of fear and mistrust that Kate Bender first emerged from obscurity into infamy. Henrio County, just outside Richmond's bustling tobacco markets, was home to dozens of sprawling plantations connected by a network of dirt roads that snaked through dense forests and treacherous swamplands. The area had become a crucial corridor for escaped slaves attempting to reach the free territories of Pennsylvania, with Underground Railroad conductors establishing secret routes through the very wilderness that would soon become Kate Bender's hunting ground. Kate Bender was not a woman anyone would easily forget. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, with shoulders broader than most men and arms that resembled tree trunks more than human limbs, she possessed a physical presence that commanded attention wherever she went. Her hands, witnesses would later testify, were so large and powerful that she could crack walnuts between her fingers and bend iron horseshoes with minimal effort. But it was her eyes that truly unsettled those who encountered her, pale gray orbs that seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if constantly calculating something others couldn't comprehend. Born Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell in 1765 to a family of poor tenant farmers in the Virginia Piedmont, Kate had learned early that survival required strength and ruthlessness. Her childhood was marked by backbreaking labor in tobacco fields and the constant threat of eviction, experiences that hardened her into someone who viewed the world through the lens of violence and struggle. By the time she reached adulthood, Kate had developed a reputation for settling disputes with her fists and intimidating grown men into submission through sheer physical presence. In 1789, she married Thomas Bender, a plantation overseer whose reputation for brutality was legendary throughout Henrio County. Thomas stood barely 5'8" in tall, but his cruelty towards the enslaved workers under his supervision was so extreme that even other overseers found his methods disturbing. He carried a leather whip embedded with metal studs and took perverse pleasure in devising psychological torments that broke spirits as thoroughly as physical punishment broke bodies. Kate, rather than being repulsed by her husband's sadistic nature, seemed to find it fascinating, often watching from the shadows as he conducted his disciplinary sessions. The Bender plantation house sat on 200 acres of prime tobacco land bordered by the Chica River to the north and dense pine forests to the south. Thomas oversaw nearly 40 enslaved workers, ruling them through a regime of terror that included public beatings, deliberate family separations, and a system of informants that pitted slave against slave. Kate, meanwhile, managed the domestic operations with an iron fist, treating the house slaves with such harshness that several attempted suicide rather than endure her daily abuse. Their marriage was as violent as it was passionate, with neighbors frequently reporting sounds of breaking furniture and shouted arguments echoing from the Bender house late into the night. Yet, Thomas seemed genuinely devoted to his massive wife, perhaps recognizing in her a kindred spirit who shared his appetite for inflicting suffering. Kate, for her part, appeared to view Thomas as the only person who truly understood her nature, the only man strong enough to match her own capacity for violence. The couple had no children, a fact that local gossips attributed to Kate's unnatural size and temperament. Dr. Samuel Rick Hardson, who occasionally attended to plantation medical needs, would later write in his private journals that Kate Bender possessed a constitution more suited to a draft horse than a woman and displayed behavioral patterns that suggested a fundamental disconnection from normal human emotion. These observations, made years before the horrors that would follow, proved to be disturbingly prophetic. By 1800, the Bender plantation had become synonymous with terror among the slave community. Stories circulated in hushed whispers about workers who had been beaten to death for minor infractions, about Kate's habit of watching punishments with obvious enjoyment, and about the way both Benders seemed to take special pleasure in breaking apart slave families. Several escape attempts had been made over the years, but Thomas's tracking skills and Kate's intimate knowledge of the surrounding wilderness made successful flight nearly impossible. It was during this period of mounting tension that rumors began spreading about Gabriel Proses's planned rebellion. Thomas Bender, as one of the county's most experienced overseers, was recruited to help coordinate the response to any potential uprising. He threw himself into the work with characteristic enthusiasm, organizing patrols, interrogating suspected conspirators, and developing strategies for suppressing rebellion before it could spread. Kate watched these preparations with growing fascination. She accompanied Thomas on several nighttime patrols, her massive frame moving through the darkness with surprising stealth as they searched for signs of slave gatherings or hidden weapons. These expeditions seemed to awaken something in Kate that had previously lain dormant, a predatory instinct that would soon find far more sinister expression. The failed rebellion of August 1800 had ended before it truly began. Betrayed by informants and SKO, entered by a fierce thunderstorm, Gabriel Prose and his co-conspirators were captured and executed, their heads displayed on pikes as warnings to others who might harbor similar thoughts. But the aftermath of the rebellion attempt created an atmosphere of paranoia that would persist for months, with plantation owners seeing potential insurrection in every gathering of slaves and responding with increasing brutality. It was in this climate of fear and repression that Thomas Bender made the decision that would ultimately seal his fate and unleash his wife's true nature upon the world. The morning of October 15, 1800, dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind carrying the scent of dying leaves through the forests of Henrico County. Thomas Bender had received word that a group of escaped slaves was moving through the area, attempting to reach the free territories to the north. According to his informants, the group consisted of 5 men and 2 women who had fled from plantations further south and were following the Chickahee River toward what they hoped would be freedom. Thomas assembled a hunting party consisting of himself, 2 neighboring overseers named Samuel Clark and William Patterson, and 4 tracking dogs bred specifically for pursuing human quarry. Kate had requested to join the expedition, arguing that her knowledge of the local terrain would prove valuable. Thomas initially resisted, claiming that hunting fugitive slaves was man's work, but Kate's insistence eventually wore down his objections. She armed herself with a heavy oak club and took her place among the hunters with an eagerness that should have alarmed those present. The tracking party set out before dawn, following the dogs as they picked up the scent trail along the riverbank. Kate moved through the underbrush with remarkable agility for someone of her size, her pale eyes scanning the forest for signs of passage that others might miss. She seemed almost excited by the hunt, frequently moving ahead of the group and calling back when she discovered broken branches or footprints that indicated their quarry's direction. By midday, they had closed considerably on the fleeing slaves. The dogs were showing increasing excitement, their baying growing more frantic as the scent trail grew fresher. Thomas estimated that they were no more than an hour behind their targets, and the group pressed forward with renewed energy. Kate, in particular, seemed energized by their proximity to their prey, her breathing becoming heavier and her movements more predatory. They found the fugitives resting in a small clearing beside a creek, clearly exhausted from their flight and unaware that their pursuers had drawn so close. The 7 slaves, ranging in age from a teenage boy to a gay-haired woman in her 50s, were sharing what appeared to be their last remaining food when the hunting party emerged from the surrounding trees. What happened next would be recounted in multiple witness testimonies, though the various accounts differ in crucial details. According to Samuel Clark's later statement to authorities, Thomas Bender ordered the fugitives to surrender and return peacefully to their owners. The eldest among them, a man named Joshua, who had been a preacher on his plantation, stepped forward and attempted to negotiate, offering to return voluntarily if the others were allowed to continue their escape. Thomas's response was to strike Joshua across the face with his whip, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding profusely. This act of violence triggered exactly the kind of desperate resistance that the hunters had perhaps been hoping for. The younger men among the fugitives rushed forward to defend their leader, while the women and the teenage boy attempted to flee deeper into the forest. In the chaos that followed, Kate Bender would later claim her husband became separated from the main group while pursuing 2 of the younger men toward the creek. The official version of events as recorded in the Henrio County Courthouse records states that Thomas Bender was found 2 hours later floating face down in the shallow water, his skull crushed by what appeared to be a heavy rock. But Kate's private account of that day, as recorded in the journal that would later be discovered among her possessions, tells a very different story. According to her own words, written in a jagged, barely legible hand, Thomas had cornered the 2 young men at the creek's edge and was attempting to beat them into submission when they turned on him with desperate fury. She claimed to have witnessed the entire attack from a distance, frozen in horror as the slaves bludgeoned her husband to death with rocks pulled from the creek bed. Whether Kate's version of events was accurate or whether she had played a more active role in her husband's death would remain a matter of speculation for investigators who examined the case decades later. What is certain is that by the time the other hunters reached the creek, Thomas Bender was dead and Kate was kneeling beside his body, her massive frame shaking with what appeared to be grief, but which several witnesses later described as something more complex and disturbing. The 2 slaves who had allegedly killed Thomas were never captured. They had vanished into the dense forest that bordered the creek, leaving behind only blood-stained rocks and the lifeless body of one of Henrio County's most feared overseers. Samuel Clark and William Patterson, shocked by the sudden turn of events, helped Kate carry her husband's body back to their horses and then escorted her home in stunned silence. The funeral of Thomas Bender was attended by nearly every plantation owner in the county, all of whom viewed his death as a direct challenge to the social order that governed their world. The fact that slaves had killed a white overseer and escaped justice was seen as an intolerable precedent that could encourage further acts of rebellion. Calls for increased patrols and harsher punishments hooed through the gathering, but Kate Bender sat through it all in apparent stone-faced silence. What none of those present could have imagined was the transformation taking place behind Kate's impassive exterior. The death of her husband had not simply devastated her. It had awakened something primal and terrible that had been sleeping within her massive frame. As she watched Thomas's coffin being lowered into the ground, Kate Bender was already planning the vengeance that would consume the remainder of her life. Dr. Richardson, who attended the funeral in his capacity as the family physician, would later write that Kate's behavior during the service struck him as profoundly unsettling. She shed no tears, spoke to no one, and seemed to be studying the other mourners with the same calculating expression she had once reserved for watching her husband's disciplinary sessions. When approached by neighbors offering condolences, she responded with monosyllabic answers delivered in a voice so flat and emotionless that several people later commented on feeling chilled by the interaction. The weeks following Thomas's burial were marked by Kate's apparent withdrawal from normal social contact. She dismissed most of the plantation's workers, retaining only enough to maintain basic operations, and began spending increasingly long periods alone in the forests surrounding her property. Neighbors who encountered her during these solitary expeditions reported that she seemed to be studying the terrain with unusual intensity, as if memorizing every tree, stream, and game trail for some unknown purpose. By December of 1800, Kate Bender had effectively disappeared from normal society. The plantation house, once a hub of brutal efficiency under Thomas's management, had become a dark and silent structure that neighbors avoided whenever possible. Local merchants noted that Kate had begun hazing unusual items, lengths of rope, metal snares, typically used for trapping large game, and tools whose intended purpose seemed unclear. It was during this period of isolation and apparent grief that Kate began developing the skills and strategies that would soon make her the most feared predator in all of Henrico County. But at the time, no one could have imagined that the grief-stricken widow was methodically preparing for a campaign of vengeance that would terrorize the region for nearly 2 years. The transformation of Kate Bender from grieving widow to methodical killer did not happen overnight. Through the bitter winter months of 1800 and into the early spring of 1801, she underwent a process of psychological metamorphosis that was as thorough as it was terrifying. The woman who emerged from this period of isolation bore little resemblance to the plantation overseer's wife who had buried her husband just months earlier. Kate's first confirmed kill occurred on the March 23, 1801, though the body would not be discovered until nearly a week later. The victim was a young man named Samuel, who had escaped from a plantation nearly 40 miles south and was attempting to follow the Chickamauga River north toward Free Territory. His body was found hanging from a massive oak tree approximately 2 mi from the Bender property, suspended by his neck with a noose fashioned from hemp rope. What made the discovery particularly disturbing was not simply the fact of Samuel's death, but the condition in which his body was found. His hands had been bound behind his back with what appeared to be leather straps, and his clothing showed evidence of a prolonged struggle through dense undergrowth. Most unsettling of all were the marks around his throat, which suggested that he had been strangled manually before being hanged, as if the killer had wanted to ensure death through multiple means. The local constable, James Whitfield, conducted a preemptive investigation that concluded Samuel had likely committed suicide in despair over his failed escape attempt. This explanation satisfied no one who actually examined the evidence, but authorities were reluctant to acknowledge that a fugitive slave had been murdered, as doing so would require them to investigate and potentially prosecute a white perpetrator. The case was officially closed within 2 weeks, and Samuel's body was buried in an unmarked grave in the county's Potter's Field. But for those who knew how to read the signs, Samuel's death marked the beginning of a pattern that would become increasingly difficult to ignore. Kate had spent the winter months studying the routes commonly used by escaping slaves, learning their habits and preferences with the same methodical precision that her husband had once applied to breaking rebellious spirits. She had discovered that fugitives tended to follow water sources when possible, both for drinking water and because streams made tracking by dogs more difficult. The Chica River and its various tributaries formed a natural highway through the forests of Henrio County, and Kate had spent countless hours mapping every bend, sandbar, and hiding place along its length. She had also learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated recent human passage: broken twigs at a certain height, disturbed leaf litter, traces of mud or fabric caught on thorns. Most importantly, she had begun to understand the psychology of desperate people, their tendency to seek shelter in certain types of locations, and their predictable responses to fear and exhaustion. Kate's second victim was a woman named Rebecca, who made the fatal mistake of seeking shelter in an abandoned tobacco barn that Kate had been watching for weeks. Rebecca had been traveling with two companions, but had become separated from them during a thunderstorm that struck the region in early April. Alone, frightened, and unfamiliar with the local terrain, she had stumbled upon what appeared to be a safe refuge and decided to rest until morning. Kate found her there just before dawn, curled up in a corner of the barn, with her few possessions clutched tightly against her chest. What followed was the first instance of the methodical cruelty that would become Kate's signature in the months to come. Rather than killing Rebecca immediately, Kate chose to prolong her victim's terror, binding her securely and then spending several hours describing in graphic detail what she intended to do. According to the journal entries that Kate made following this encounter, she derived immense satisfaction from watching Rebecca's growing desperation, from seeing the hope gradually drained from her eyes as she realized that no rescue was coming. Kate wrote extensively about the purity of her victim's fear, describing it as something beautiful and necessary that helped to balance the scales of justice for her husband's death. Rebecca's body was discovered 3 days later by a farmer searching for stray cattle. She had been strangled with her own clothing and left propped against a tree in a seated position, as if Kate wanted to ensure that the body would be found quickly. The positioning was clearly deliberate, designed to send a message to anyone who might be considering similar escape attempts. This time, Constable Whitfield could not dismiss the death as suicide. The evidence of foul play was too obvious, and the deliberate staging of the body suggested a killer who wanted their work to be discovered and understood. Whitfield launched what he described as a thorough investigation, but his efforts were hampered by the same social constraints that had limited his response to Samuel's death. The idea that a white person might be systematically murdering escaped slaves was too disturbing for local authorities to seriously consider. Instead, Whitfield focused his investigation on the possibility that Rebecca had been killed by other slaves, perhaps as punishment for some perceived betrayal, or as part of an internal power struggle among fugitive groups. This theory satisfied the social expectations of the time while avoiding the more troubling implications of the alternative explanation. The case remained officially open, but no serious effort was made to pursue leads that might implicate a white perpetrator. Meanwhile, Kate was already planning her next hunt. Rebecca's death had taught her valuable lessons about the logistics of murder, the importance of choosing isolated locations, the need to dispose of evidence properly, and the psychological satisfaction that came from total control over another human being's final moments. She had discovered within herself a capacity for cruelty that surpassed even her late husband's legendary brutality, and she found this discovery both thrilling and validating. The spring and early summer of 1801 saw an escalation in both the frequency and brutality of Kate's attacks. Her third victim was a teenage boy named Marcus, who had escaped from a plantation in neighboring Chesterfield County. Kate tracked him for 3 days through the forest, observing his movements and studying his habits before finally cornering him near a creek where he had stopped to drink. Marcus represented Kate's first opportunity to test her physical capabilities against a victim who was young, strong, and desperate enough to fight back with genuine ferocity. The struggle lasted nearly 20 minutes, with Marcus managing to land several solid blows that left Kate bruised and bloodied. But her superior size and strength eventually prevailed, and she strangled the boy with her bare hands while pinning him beneath her massive frame. The satisfaction Kate derived from this kill was different from her previous experiences, more physical, more primal, and somehow more complete. She had proven to herself that she could overpower even a strong, determined opponent through pure physical dominance, and this realization filled her with a sense of power unlike anything she had previously experienced. Her journal entries from this period reveal an almost sexual gratification in describing the moment when Marcus finally stopped struggling, when his eyes rolled back and his body went limp beneath her. Marcus's body was found hanging from a tree branch 20 feet above the ground, a feat that would have required enormous strength and determination to accomplish. The message was clear to anyone familiar with the previous murders. A powerful and methodical killer was targeting escaped slaves throughout the region, and no one was safe from their reach. By this point, even the most willfully blind authorities could no longer ignore the pattern that was emerging. 3 escaped slaves had been murdered within a 2-month period, all within a relatively small geographic area, all displaying evidence of having been overpowered by someone of exceptional physical strength. Constable Whitfield, under pressure from plantation owners who were beginning to worry about the implications of the murders, finally acknowledged that a serial killer was operating in Henrio County. But acknowledging the problem and solving it proved to be very different things. Kate had become incredibly skilled at covering her tracks, both literally and figuratively. She knew the forest better than anyone else in the county, could move through dense undergrowth without leaving obvious signs of passage, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict where fugitive slaves would travel and when they would need to rest. More importantly, Kate had learned to manage the social aspects of her secret life with remarkable effectiveness. In public, she maintained the persona of a grieving widow struggling to manage her late husband's property. She attended church services regularly, made appropriate responses when neighbors inquired about her welfare, and conducted business transactions with the same stolid efficiency that had characterized her behavior before Thomas's death. No one suspected that the woman who sat quietly in the third pew of Henrio Methodist Church every Sunday morning was the same person who spent her weeknights stalking human prey through the surrounding forests. Kate had discovered an extraordinary talent for compartmentalization, maintaining completely separate identities for her public and private lives with a skill that would have impressed professional actors. The psychological transformation that enabled this dual existence was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Kate's evolution from ordinary citizen to serial killer. She had developed an internal narrative that justified her actions as not merely acceptable but necessary and righteous. In her mind, every escaped slave she killed was balancing the scales of justice for her husband's murder, restoring the natural order that had been disrupted by their rebellion against legitimate authority. This sense of righteousness gave Kate's actions a methodical, ritualistic quality that distinguished her work from ordinary crime or violence. She was not killing in rage or passion, but in service to what she genuinely believed was a higher moral purpose. This conviction made her incredibly dangerous because it removed the normal psychological barriers that might have limited her actions or forced her to confront the enormity of what she was doing. As spring turned to summer in 1801, Kate Bender had fully transformed into something that transcended ordinary criminal categories. She was no longer simply a murderer but a predator who had found her natural environment and prey. The forests of Henrio County had become her hunting ground, and every escaped slave who entered that territory was placing their life at risk from a killer whose capabilities were still growing with each successful hunt. By midsummer of 1801, Kate Bender had refined her methods to a level of efficiency that would have impressed military strategy sets. She had divided the forests of Henrio County into a series of overlapping territories, each of which she patrolled on a rotating schedule designed to maximize her chances of encountering fugitive slaves while minimizing the risk of being observed by other whites. Her intimate knowledge of the terrain, combined with an almost preternatural ability to predict human behavior under stress, made her nearly unstoppable. Kate's typical hunting cycle began with reconnaissance. She would spend 3 or 4 thin days moving through a selected territory, looking for signs of recent passage and identifying likely camping spots or hiding places. Her ability to read subtle environmental clues had developed to an extraordinary degree. She could determine from the pattern of broken twigs not only that someone had passed through an area, but approximately when, in which direction they were traveling, and even their approximate size and physical condition. Once she had identified signs of fugitive presence, Kate would establish what she termed observation posts. Carefully concealed positions that allowed her to watch likely routes or destinations without being detected herself. She had constructed more than a dozen of these posts throughout her hunting territory, each equipped with supplies that allowed her to remain hidden for extended periods. From these positions, she could study her prey's habits and behavioral patterns, learning their schedules and identifying their weaknesses. The psychological profile Kate developed of typical fugitive slaves was remarkably sophisticated and devastatingly accurate. She understood that most escapees would be traveling at night to avoid detection, that they would seek water sources for drinking and washing, and that they would prefer dense cover during daylight hours. More subtly, she recognized that fear and exhaustion would make them predictable in their decision-making, causing them to choose the most obvious shelter or the most direct route, even when alternatives might be safer. Kate also understood the social dynamics that governed fugitive groups. She knew that families would not abandon injured or exhausted members, that groups would often split up when pursued and attempt to reunite at predetermined locations, and that lone travelers were more likely to take desperate risks than those traveling with companions. This knowledge allowed her to manipulate her victims' behavior, using their own survival instincts and loyalty to their companions against them. Her fourth confirmed victim was a man named Isaiah, who had escaped from a plantation in Gland County with his pregnant wife Sarah and their 8-year-old son, David. The family had been traveling for nearly a week when Kate first spotted them resting beside a small stream, approximately 3 mi from her property. Rather than attacking immediately, Kate chose to observe the family for 2 days, studying their routines and identifying the psychological leverage points she could exploit. What she discovered was that Isaiah was becoming increasingly desperate as his wife's pregnancy advanced and travel became more difficult for her. Sarah was experiencing complications that were slowing their progress significantly, and young David was showing signs of illness that worried both parents. The family was essentially trapped between the impossibility of continuing their flight and the certainty of recapture if they remained stationary too long. Kate's attack on the family demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that was truly chilling. Rather than confronting them directly, she began by targeting their supplies and shelter materials. Over the course of several nights, she stole their blankets, contaminated their water source, and created signs of pursuing slave catchers that forced them to abandon relatively safe camping spots for more exposed positions. The psychological pressure of these tactics wore down the family's resistance more effectively than direct violence could have accomplished. Isaiah became increasingly paranoid and exhausted, making poor decisions that placed his family in greater danger. Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate and David began showing signs of serious malnutrition. By the time Kate finally revealed herself, the family was too weakened and demoralized to mount effective resistance. Kate's journal entries describing the family's final days make for extremely disturbing reading even 2 centuries later. She wrote extensively about the educational value of slowly breaking down their hope and determination, comparing the process to training difficult horses or breaking stubborn dogs. She seemed to view their suffering not as cruel or unnecessary, but as a natural and inevitable consequence of their decision to challenge the established social order. The actual murders were carried out over a period of 3 days with Kate, deliberately prolonging the family's agony for her own psychological satisfaction. She killed David first, strangling him while forcing his parents to watch, then used the child's death as leverage to torture Isaiah and Sarah, with descriptions of what she planned to do to each of them. The journal entries suggest that Kate derived particular satisfaction from Sarah's begging for her unborn child's life, seeing it as proof of the fundamental weakness that made slaves unsuitable for freedom. Isaiah's death came on the second day after Kate had forced him to dig graves for his son and pregnant wife. She strangled him with the same rope she had used on David, then left his body beside the shallow graves as what she described as a monument to the futility of rebellion. Sarah, already weakened by pregnancy, complications, and psychological trauma, survived less than 6 hours after her husband's death, dying of what appeared to be a combination of stress, dehydration, and despair. The discovery of the family's bodies created a level of alarm in Henrio County that authorities could no longer ignore or minimize. 3 more escaped Slavs had been murdered, including a pregnant woman and a child, and the evidence pointed unmistakably to a single killer operating with increasing confidence and brutality. Plantation owners throughout the region began pressuring local authorities to take decisive action, while slaves whispered stories about the white demon who haunted the forests between Virginia and freedom. Constable Whitfield, recognizing that his position might depend on finding the killer, finally launched what he described as a comprehensive investigation into the murders. He organized search parties to comb the forests where the bodies had been found, interviewed potential witnesses, and even offered a modest reward for information leading to the killer's capture, but his efforts were hampered by several factors that Kate had cleverly exploited in planning her campaign. First, the investigation was constrained by the same social attitudes that had initially prevented authorities from taking the murders seriously. Most white residents of Henrio County viewed escaped slaves as criminals who had brought whatever fate befell them upon themselves. There was little sympathy for the victims and even less enthusiasm for expending significant resources to find their killer. Many whites privately applauded the murders, seeing them as appropriate punishment for slaves who had dared to seek freedom. Second, Kate's selection of hunting territory had been strategically brilliant. The forests where she operated were vast, dense, and familiar to very few people other than herself. Search parties could spend weeks combing the area without discovering even a fraction of the hiding places, trails, and landmarks that Kate knew intimately. Her ability to observe potential searches while remaining hidden herself meant that she could avoid detection even when they came relatively close to her position. Most importantly, no one suspected that a woman could be responsible for murders that required such obvious physical strength and savage determination. The assumption that the killer must be male eliminated Kate from consideration before the investigation even began, allowing her to continue operating under a cloak of social invisibility that proved nearly impenetrable. Kate was well aware of these advantages, and her journal entries from this period reveal a growing confidence in her ability to continue killing without facing serious consequences. She had begun to view the murders not as a temporary campaign of vengeance, but as a permanent vocation that gave her life meaning and purpose. The transformation from grieving widow to serial killer was now complete, and Kate Bender had found her true calling. The late summer and early fall of 1801 saw an acceleration in Kate's killing schedule that reflected both her growing confidence and her increasing psychological need for the satisfaction that murder provided. Her victims during this period included a blacksmith named Abraham who had escaped from Richmond, twin brothers named Matthew and Mark who had fled from a plantation in Charles City County, and an elderly woman named Ruth who had been traveling alone toward what she hoped would be sanctuary with free blacks in Pennsylvania. Each murder demonstrated refinements in Kate's technique and psychology. She had learned to extend the psychological torture that preceded death, developing methods of mental torment that were sometimes more effective than physical violence in breaking her victim's will to resist. She had also begun taking trophies from each kill, items of clothing, personal possessions, or body parts that she kept as reminders of her accomplishments. The trophy collection, hidden in a specially constructed cellar beneath her house, became an obsession that consumed increasing amounts of Kate's attention. She would spend hours arranging and rearranging the items, reliving each murder through the physical evidence of her victim's final moments. The journal entries describing these sessions reveal a mind that had crossed permanently into territory that could only be described as pure evil. By October of 1801, Kate Bender had killed at least 12 escaped slaves, and rumors of the forest demon had begun spreading throughout the Underground Railroad network. Conductors started warning potential escapees about the unusual dangers present in Henry County, and some routes were permanently altered to avoid the area entirely. But for Kate, this represented not a setback but an exciting new challenge. She began expanding her hunting territory, following potential victims further from her home base and developing new strategies for locating prey in unfamiliar terrain. The hunting season that had begun with her husband's death showed no signs of ending, and Kate Bender was just beginning to explore the full extent of her capacity for evil. As autumn deepened into winter, Kate Bender's reputation had transcended the boundaries of Henry County and begun spreading throughout Virginia's Underground Railroad network like a malignant tumor. Conductors and station masters who had never seen her handiwork firsthand nevertheless spoke in hushed tones about the white demon who stalked the forests between Richmond and Freedom, turning what should have been a corridor of hope into a landscape of terror and death. The psychological impact of Kate's campaign extended far beyond her actual body count. For every escaped slave she murdered, dozens of others were paralyzed by fear, abandoning escape attempts or choosing longer, more dangerous routes that often proved just as deadly. The Underground Railroad network that had been developing in central Virginia was effectively crippled as conductors found it increasingly difficult to convince potential escapees that the risks of flight were manageable. Kate understood this psychological warfare, recombinant of her work, and deliberately cultivated it through increasingly theatrical staging of her victims' bodies. She had begun arranging corpses in positions designed to maximize their psychological impact on anyone who discovered them, creating scenes that would haunt witnesses for years to come. Bodies hanging from trees became her signature, but she varied the specific details to prevent observers from becoming desensitized to the horror. Her 13th victim, a young woman named Charity who had escaped from a plantation near Petersburg, was found suspended upside down from a massive oak tree. Her throat cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. The positioning required enormous physical strength to accomplish, but also demonstrated a level of theatrical cruelty that went far beyond simple murder. Kate wanted anyone who discovered Charity's body to understand that they were dealing with something beyond ordinary human evil. The effect was exactly what Kate had intended. Word of Charity's death spread throughout the slave community like wildfire, accompanied by increasingly elaborate descriptions of the killer's supernatural powers and inhuman strength. Some stories claimed that the demon could track victims by scent alone, others that it could move through the forest without making a sound, and still others that it fed on the fear of its prey before delivering the final, killing blow. Kate's journal entries from this period reveal her satisfaction with these growing legends about her capabilities. She had begun to see herself not simply as an instrument of vengeance for her husband's death, but as a force of nature, a living embodiment of the consequences that awaited slaves who dared to seek freedom. The mythology surrounding her activities fed her growing sense of invincibility and encouraged her to take increasingly bold risks in pursuit of new victims. Winter hunting presented unique challenges that Kate approached with characteristic methodical precision. Snow made tracking easier in some respects as footprints. It became impossible to disguise, but it also made her own movements more visible to potential witnesses. She adapted by developing new techniques for moving across snowy terrain without leaving clear tracks, including the use of specially modified shoes that distributed her considerable weight more evenly and created ambiguous impressions that could be mistaken for animal tracks. The cold weather also changed the behavior patterns of her prey in ways that Kate learned to exploit ruthlessly. Escaped slaves traveling in winter were forced to seek shelter more frequently and for longer periods, making them more predictable in their movements and more vulnerable to extended observation. They also left more obvious signs of their presence: smoke from fires, disturbed snow around shelters, and the inevitable debris that accumulated around temporary camps. Kate's 14th victim was a middle-aged man named Ezekiel, who had escaped from a plantation in Hanover County during a Christmas Day celebration when security was relaxed. He had made the mistake of seeking shelter in an abandoned tobacco barn that Kate had been watching for weeks, correctly anticipating that the structure's apparent isolation and sturdy construction would make it attractive to fugitives seeking protection from the brutal winter weather. Ezekiel had been in the barn for less than 3 hours when Kate arrived, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the silent efficiency that had become her trademark. Rather than confronting him immediately, she chose to trap him inside by barring the doors from the outside, then spent several hours psychologically tormenting him by scratching on the walls, making inhuman sounds, and occasionally allowing him glimpses of her massive silhouette through gaps in the building's weathered boards. The psychological torture that preceded Ezekiel's death lasted nearly 8 hours, during which Kate systematically destroyed his sanity through a combination of sensory deprivation, false hope, and carefully calculated terror. She would disappear for long periods, allowing him to believe that his tormentor had left, then return with new horrors designed to crush whatever optimism might have developed during her absence. Her journal describes this process as educational, claiming that it was important for slaves to understand the full consequences of their rebellion before receiving their final punishment. When Kate finally entered the barn to deliver the killing blow, Ezekiel had been reduced to a gibbering, broken creature who offered no resistance to his fate. She strangled him with methodical efficiency, then spent additional time arranging his body in a position that would maximize the psychological impact on whoever discovered it. Ezekiel was found 3 days later by a farmer searching for stray cattle, suspended from the barn's central beam in a noose fashioned from his own clothing. The discovery of Ezekiel's body marked a turning point in the official response to Kate's campaign of terror. Constable Whitfield, under increasing pressure from both plantation owners and state authorities in Richmond, finally acknowledged that the murders represented a threat to the social order that transcended their immediate impact on the slave community. If escaped slaves were being systematically murdered by an unknown killer, it suggested a breakdown in law and enforcement that could encourage other forms of vigilante violence. Governor James Monroe, responding to reports from Henry County, authorized the deployment of state militia resources to assist in tracking down the killer. A company of 20 militiamen, under the command of Captain Robert Hayes, was dispatched to the area with orders to conduct a systematic search of the forests where the murders had occurred. The militiamen were experienced woodsmen and Indian fighters who possessed tracking skills that far exceeded those of local constables. Kate observed the arrival of the militia with interest rather than concern. Her journal entries from this period reveal a confidence in her abilities that bordered on contempt for her pursuers. She had spent more than a year learning every trail, stream, and hiding place in her hunting territory. While the militia men were operating in unfamiliar terrain, under pressure to produce quick results. More importantly, they were looking for a male killer, which meant that Kate could observe their movements without arousing suspicion as long as she maintained her public persona as a grieving widow. The militia's search efforts proved to be woefully inadequate for the task at hand. The forests of Henrico County covered hundreds of square miles of dense woodland, swampland, and broken terrain that would have challenged even the most experienced trackers. Kate's intimate knowledge of the area allowed her to stay ahead of search parties while continuing to observe potential prey, and she quickly identified weaknesses in their search patterns that she could exploit. More significantly, the presence of the militia actually improved Kate's hunting opportunities by driving escaped slaves away from their normal routes and into unfamiliar territory where they were more likely to make fatal mistakes. Several fugitives, attempting to avoid the search parties, blundered into areas that Kate controlled more completely, making them easier targets for her increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques. Her 15th victim was a teenage girl named Patience, who had become separated from a larger group while fleeing from militia patrols. Alone, frightened, and unfamiliar with the local terrain, Patience made a series of poor decisions that placed her directly in Kate's path. She sought shelter in a cave that Kate had been watching for months, correctly anticipating that its apparent security would make it attractive to desperate fugitives. Kate's murder of Patience represented a new level of sadistic creativity that demonstrated her evolving psychological pathology. Rather than killing the girl immediately, Kate chose to keep her alive for nearly a week, using her as bait to attract other escaped slaves who might be searching for their missing companion. She bound Patience securely within the cave, then used her cries for help to lure 2 additional victims to their deaths. Over the following days, the 3 bodies were discovered by militia searches, arranged in a grotesque tableau that shocked even experienced soldiers. Kate had positioned them to suggest that they had died defending each other, but the evidence of prolonged torture and the theatrical staging of the scene left no doubt that they had been murdered by someone whose cruelty transcended ordinary human evil. Captain Hayes, in his official report to Governor Monroe, described the scene as evidence of depravity so profound as to challenge belief in the killer's fundamental humanity. The militia's failure to capture or even identify the killer after 6 weeks of intensive searching led to their withdrawal from Henrico County in February of 1802. Captain Hayes privately admitted to Governor Monroe that his men were operating at a severe disadvantage against someone who knew the terrain intimately and possessed tracking skills that exceeded their own. He recommended that a different approach might be necessary, possibly involving the use of civilian trackers who were more familiar with local conditions. But, for Kate Bender, the militia's departure represented a decisive victory that confirmed her growing sense of invincibility. She had not only continued killing throughout their search efforts, but had actually used their presence to improve her hunting success. The psychological impact of this triumph pushed her further toward viewing herself as something beyond ordinary human limitations. A predator so perfectly adapted to her environment, though, at conventional law enforcement could never hope to contain her. Spring of 1802 brought with it a renewed wave of escape attempts as warmer weather made travel easier, and the temporary presence of militia patrols created a false sense that the killer had been captured or driven away. Kate observed this seasonal increase in fugitive activity with predatory satisfaction, recognizing that the accumulated fear and mythology surrounding her activities had created exactly the psychological condition she needed to maximize her hunting success. The stories circulating through the slave community had evolved into elaborate folklore that bore only passing resemblance to reality, but which served Kate's purposes perfectly by creating an atmosphere of supernatural dread that paralyzed rational decision-making. Some tales claimed that the demon could assume any shape it chose. Others that it could appear in multiple locations simultaneously, and still others that it fed on the souls of its victims rather than simply killing their bodies. Kate encouraged these superstitions through increasingly elaborate staging of murder scenes that incorporated elements designed to suggest otherworldly powers. She had begun arranging bodies in patterns that suggested ritualistic purposes, leaving behind objects and symbols that had no actual meaning, but which appeared significant to observers desperate to understand what they were confronting. Her 16th victim, a blacksmith named Daniel, who had escaped from a plantation in New Kent County, was found crucified against a massive oak tree with railroad spikes driven through his hands and feet. The crucifixion scene required planning and preparation that demonstrated Kate's evolution from opportunistic killer to methodical artist of death. She had spent weeks acquiring the necessary materials, studying Daniel's travel patterns, and preparing the murder site to maximize its psychological impact. The religious symbolism was carefully calculated to suggest that the killer viewed escape slaves not simply as criminals, but as sinners deserving of divine punishment. Daniel's death marked the beginning of what Kate privately termed her theological period, during which she began incorporating increasingly elaborate religious imagery into her murder scenes. Her journal entries from this time reveal a belief system that combined perverted Christianity with racial ideology and personal vengeance into a coherent worldview that justified virtually any level of cruelty toward her chosen victims. According to Kate's twisted theology, slavery represented God's intended order for human society, with whites serving as divinely appointed masters over inferior races created specifically for agricultural labor. Escaped slaves were not simply lawbreakers but rebels against God's natural order who deserved punishment that transcended mere death. By killing them in increasingly elaborate and symbolic ways, Kate believed she was serving as an instrument of divine justice while simultaneously avenging her husband's murder. This theological framework provided Kate with a sense of righteous purpose that made her even more dangerous than simple sadism could have accomplished. She no longer saw herself as a criminal or vigilante, but as a holy warrior engaged in sacred work that required her to overcome normal, human squeamishness about inflicting suffering. The murders became religious ceremonies in her mind, with each victim serving as a sacrifice offered to restore the cosmic balance that had been disrupted by slave rebellion. Kate's 17th victim, a woman named Miriam, who had escaped with her 2 young daughters, became the subject of an extended religious drama that lasted nearly 2 weeks. Kate tracked the family to a hidden shelter in a swamp, then spent days observing their routines and studying their relationship dynamics before beginning the psychological torture that would precede their deaths. Rather than attacking the family directly, Kate began by leaving religious symbols and biblical quotations in locations where they would be discovered by her intended victims. The messages, carefully selected from Old Testament passages dealing with divine punishment and the consequences of rebellion, were designed to create an atmosphere of supernatural dread that would weaken the family's psychological resistance. The campaign of psychological warfare proved devastatingly effective. Miriam, already exhausted and terrified by weeks of flight, began to interpret Kate's planted messages as signs of divine displeasure with her escape attempt. She became convinced that God was punishing her for the sin of seeking freedom. And this conviction paralyzed her ability to make rational decisions about protecting herself and her children. Kate's journal entries describing Miriam's psychological breakdown reveal a sophisticated understanding of religious psychology and its potential for manipulation. She had identified her victim's deep Christian faith as a weakness that could be exploited more effectively than direct threats or violence, and she used this knowledge to destroy Miriam's will to resist without laying a hand on her. The actual murders, when they finally occurred, were staged as elaborate religious tableaux that incorporated symbols and rituals from multiple Christian traditions. Kate arranged the bodies to suggest that the family had been struck down by divine wrath while attempting to escape their divinely ordained bondage, complete with burned biblical quotations and religious artifacts that suggested supernatural intervention. The discovery of Miriam and her daughters created a new level of terror within the slave community that went beyond anything Kate had previously achieved. The religious staging of the murders suggested that the killer possessed not only supernatural strength and cunning, but divine sanction for their activities. Slaves who had previously viewed escape as dangerous but possible began to see it as literally cursed, a sin so profound that it would draw down divine punishment not only on the escapees themselves but on anyone who helped them. This theological dimension of Kate's campaign proved to be her most effective weapon in the war against the Underground Railroad network. Conductors found it increasingly difficult to convince potential escapees that the risks were manageable when the killer appeared to possess not only human cunning but divine approval. Several established routes were permanently abandoned, and the flow of escaped slaves through central Virginia slowed to a trickle. Kate's 18th victim was a teenage boy named Joseph, who had escaped alone from a plantation in Powhatan County. His murder demonstrated the full evolution of Kate's techniques, from simple killing to elaborate psychological and spiritual warfare. She stalked Joseph for nearly a month, studying his habits and gradually wearing down his psychological defenses through a campaign of supernatural terror that left him convinced he was being pursued by demons. The psychological torture that preceded Joseph's death was so thorough that by the time Kate finally revealed herself, the boy was actually grateful for human contact, even though he recognized her as his killer. Kate's journal describes his relief at discovering that his tormentor was a human being rather than a supernatural entity, and her satisfaction at crushing this final hope by explaining that she was indeed an instrument of divine vengeance sent to punish his rebellion against God's natural order. Joseph's body was found arranged in a crucifixion, pose similar to Daniel's, but with additional religious symbolism that suggested increasingly elaborate theological justifications for the murders. Kate had begun incorporating elements from multiple Christian denominations, creating hybrid rituals that appeared to draw from Baptist, Methodist, and even Catholic traditions, while serving her own twisted purposes. The theological sophistication of these later murder scenes caught the attention of religious authorities throughout Virginia, who recognized that someone with significant biblical knowledge was responsible for the killings. Several prominent ministers attempted to intervene by preaching sermons that condemned vigilante violence and emphasized the Christian duty to show mercy even toward escaped slaves. But their efforts were hampered by the uncomfortable fact that many of their parishioners privately supported the killer's actions. Reverend Samuel Crawford of Henrio Methodist Church, where Kate maintained regular attendance, later wrote that he had begun to suspect that the killer might be someone within his own congregation. The biblical quotations used in the murder scenes demonstrated familiarity with specific translations and interpretations that suggested formal religious education rather than folk Christianity. But his suspicions never focused on Kate, whose public persona as a grieving widow struggling with her faith seemed inconsistent with the theological sophistication displayed in the murders. Kate's ability to maintain her dual identity had reached a level of psychological compartmentalization that was truly extraordinary. She could participate in Sunday morning worship services with apparent sincerity while spending her weekend-nights engaged in activities that represented the complete perversion of every Christian principle. Her journal entries reveal no sense of contradiction between these two aspects of her life, suggesting a degree of mental dissociation that allowed her to function as both a normal community member and a predatory killer without experiencing cognitive dissonance. By summer of 1802, Kate Bender had achieved a level of dominance over her chosen hunting territory that was unprecedented in American criminal history. She had effectively shut down underground railroad operations throughout Central Virginia, terrorized the slave community into abandoning most escape attempts, and created a mythology around her, activities that served to multiply her actual impact exponentially. She had become, in every sense, the perfect predator, so perfectly adapted to her environment and prey that conventional law enforcement seemed powerless to stop her. But perfection, as Kate would soon discover, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Her very success had created conditions that would eventually lead to her downfall, though not in any way that she could have anticipated. The late summer of 1802 brought an unexpected development that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of Kate's hunting campaign. A group of free blacks from Philadelphia, led by a former slave named Augustus Freeman, who had escaped from Virginia 15 years earlier, had been following reports of the systematic murders with growing alarm. Freeman, who had become a successful businessman and prominent member of Philadelphia's abolition movement, recognized that the killer in Henrio County represented a threat that transcended local concerns. Freeman had maintained contact with Underground Railroad conductors throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, and he understood that Kate's campaign was effectively strangling one of the most important escape routes between the Deep South and freedom. More than 30 confirmed murders had occurred over an 18-month period, with additional disappearances suggesting that the actual body count might be significantly higher. The psychological impact of the killings had spread far beyond Virginia, discouraging escape attempts throughout the Corollas in Georgia. Working with Underground Railroad leaders, including the legendary Harriet Tubman, who had successfully guided multiple groups through dangerous territory without losing a single person, Freeman developed a plan to track down and neutralize the killer through methods that law enforcement had failed to implement effectively. The plan called for a systematic investigation that would combine the tracking skills of experienced outdoorsmen with intelligence-gathering techniques that had proven successful in other Underground Railroad operations. Freeman assembled a team of 8 men, all of whom were either escaped slaves themselves or free blacks with extensive experience in clandestine operations. The team included trackers who could read sign-in conditions that baffled white searchers, intelligence specialists who could gather information from slave communities without arousing suspicion, and combat veterans who possessed the tactical skills necessary to confront a killer who had already demonstrated supernatural cunning and brutality. The team arrived in Henrio County in early September, posing as itinerant workers seeking employment in tobacco harvest operations. Their presence attracted no attention from local whites who viewed traveling blacks as a normal part of the seasonal labor force. But within the slave community, word spread quickly that special people had arrived to deal with the demon that had been terrorizing the region for nearly 2 years. Freeman's investigation began with a systematic analysis of the murder sites that revealed patterns invisible to previous searchers. The team's tracking specialists, working with information provided by local slaves who had been too frightened to cooperate with white authorities, began to develop a comprehensive map of the killer's territory and movement patterns. What emerged was a picture of someone who possessed an almost supernatural knowledge of local terrain, combined with a methodical approach to victim selection that suggested military-style planning. The investigation team's most significant breakthrough came when they recognized the Tsitawag. At all of the murder sites were located within a roughly circular area centered on the abandoned Bender plantation. Local slaves had avoided providing this information to white authorities because they feared being accused of the murders themselves, but they shared it willingly with Freeman's team once they understood that experienced professionals had arrived to solve the problem. Freeman personally conducted surveillance of the Bender property using skills developed during his own escape 15 years earlier to observe the location without being detected. What he discovered was that the supposedly abandoned plantation showed subtle signs of recent habitation. Smoke from fires that were carefully concealed, evidence of regular travel on overgrown paths, and the presence of supplies that suggested someone was using the property as a base of operations. More significantly, Freeman observed Kate herself during one of her nighttime preparations for a hunting expedition. He watched from concealment as she emerged from the apparently empty house, armed herself with rope and metal, implements whose purpose was unclear, and disappeared into the forest with a stealth and purpose that left no doubt about her identity as the killer they sought. The revelation that the murders were being committed by a white woman struck Freeman's team as almost incomprehensible, challenging their assumptions about both the killer's identity and motivations. They had expected to find a rogue slave, catcher, or possibly a deranged white man, but the idea that a plantation widow could be responsible for such systematic brutality required them to completely reassess their understanding of the situation. Freeman spent 3 additional nights observing Kate's activities, documenting her routines, and studying her methods with the thoroughness of a military intelligence officer. What he discovered was that Kate had developed a level of expertise in tracking and killing human prey that surpassed anything he had encountered during his own years of dangerous flight from bondage. She mows, ved through the forest with the silent efficiency of a natural predator, followed trails that were invisible to normal observation, and demonstrated a patience and persistence that made her nearly unstoppable. But Freeman also identified weaknesses in Kate's approach that could be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge and preparation. Her very success had made her overconfident, and she had fallen into patterns of behavior that made her movements predictable to careful observers. More importantly, her focus on escaped slaves had blinded her to the possibility that she might herself become the hunted rather than the hunter. Freeman's plan for dealing with Kate required a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that reflected his team's extensive experience in clandestine operations. Rather than confronting her directly, which would place them at a severe disadvantage in terrain she knew intimately, they would use her own methods against her by becoming the hunters in a deadly game where she was the prey. The plan called for Freeman's team to stage a fake escape attempt that would draw Kate into pursuing what appeared to be a vulnerable target. One team member, a young man named Samuel, who bore a strong resemblance to the typical profile of Kate's victims, would travel along routes that previous escapees had used, leaving sign that would attract Kate's attention and draw her into a carefully prepared ambush site. The psychological component of the plan was equally important. Freeman understood that Kate's success depended largely on her victims' fear and disorientation, emotions that prevented them from thinking clearly about escape or resistance. By contrast, his team would be calm, prepared, and working from detailed intelligence about Kate's methods and capabilities. They would have every advantage that Kate typically possessed, while she would be operating under the same disadvantages that had doomed her previous victims. The execution of Freeman's plan began on the night of September 23rd, when Samuel set out from a location approximately 10 mi south of the Bender property, following a route that careful analysis had shown to be one of Kate's preferred hunting corridors. Samuel was an experienced Underground Railroad conductor himself, and he possessed the skills necessary to leave sign that would appear authentic to Kate while avoiding the subtle mistakes that had doomed genuine escapees. Kate discovered Samuel's trail within 2 days, exactly as Freeman had predicted. Her journal entries from this period reveal her excitement at finding what appeared to be a particularly promising target. A young, apparently healthy male, traveling alone and following predictable routes toward the Free Territories. She began her usual pattern of extended observation, unaware that she was being observed in turn by Freeman's team members who had positioned themselves throughout the area. The cat-and-mouse game that followed lasted nearly a week with Kate, stalking Samuel while Freeman's team tracked both of them through the dense forests of Henrio County. Samuel played his role perfectly, displaying the right combination of caution and desperation that characterized genuine escapees while leading Kate steadily toward the ambush site that Freeman had prepared. Kate's journal entries reveal growing anticipation as she prepared to claim what she expected would be her 19th victim. she had begun planning an even more elaborate theological display than her previous murders, intending to use Samuel's death to send a message that would completely crush any remaining Underground Railroad activity in Central Virginia. Her confidence in her own invincibility had reached a level that bordered on megalomania, and she approached what she expected to be another routine kill with the casual arrogance of a master craftsman practicing familiar skills. But as Kate prepared to spring what she believed was her trap, she was walking directly into Freeman's carefully laid snare. The hunter, who had terrorized Central Virginia for nearly 2 years, was about to discover that she had finally encountered prey that could bite back with deadly effectiveness. The confrontation between Kate Bender and Freeman's team occurred in a small clearing beside Mill Creek, approximately 5 miles southeast of the Bender plantation. Freeman had chosen the location carefully, identifying a site that offered multiple escape routes for his team while limiting Kate's options for retreat or concealment. The clearing was surrounded by dense undergrowth that would conceal his men, while providing clear fields of fire toward the center, where Kate would be, drawn by Samuel's apparent vulnerability. Kate approached the clearing just before dawn on September 29th, moving with the confident stealth that had served her so well in previous hunts. Samuel had made camp in the center of the clearing the previous evening, building a small fire and displaying the exhausted carelessness that characterized genuine escapees who believed themselves temporarily safe. To Kate's experienced eye, he represented exactly the kind of easy target that had made her reputation as the most feared predator in Central Virginia. What Kate could not have known was that 7 men armed with rifles and possessing extensive combat experience were positioned in concealment around the clearing's perimeter, each with a clear line of sight to the area where she would emerge. Freeman himself occupied a position that allowed him to observe Kate's approach while maintaining command and control over his team's response to whatever tactics she might employ. Kate's attack followed the pattern she had perfected over 18 months of systematic murder. She emerged from the forest with explosive speed, covering the distance to Samuel's apparently sleeping form in seconds and attempting to overpower him before he could mount effective resistance. Her massive hands reached for his throat with the same brutal efficiency that had claimed the lives of at least 30 previous victims. But Samuel was not asleep, and he was far from helpless. As Kate's hands closed around his throat, he twisted away with practiced skill, while simultaneously calling out the signal that triggered Freeman's ambush. 7 rifles fired almost simultaneously, sending a volley of musk balls toward Kate's position with devastating accuracy. Kate's superhuman strength and quick reflexes saved her from immediate death, but could not prevent the multiple wounds that sent her crashing to the ground in the center of the clearing. 2 musk balls had struck her in the chest, another had shattered her left arm, and a 4th had torn through the muscle of her right thigh. Any normal person would have been killed instantly or rendered completely helpless. But Kate's massive frame and incredible toughness allowed her to survive injuries that would have been immediately fatal to someone of ordinary constitution. The sight of Kate struggling to rise despite wounds that should have killed her struck Freeman's team as genuinely supernatural, confirming some of the more extreme stories they had heard about the demon of Henrio County. Her survival of the initial volley suggested that they were indeed dealing with something beyond ordinary human limitations, and several team members began to question whether conventional weapons could stop her at all. But Freeman had anticipated this possibility, and he had prepared accordingly. As Kate attempted to crawl toward the treine despite her massive injuries, Freeman emerged from concealment with a loaded pistol and approached to within 10 feet of her position. The conversation that followed, as recorded in Freeman's detailed report to Underground Railroad leaders, revealed the full extent of Kate's psychological pathology while demonstrating that she remained dangerous even while mortally wounded. Kate's first words, spoken through blood-foamed lips as she struggled to breathe with punctured lungs, were not pleased for mercy or expressions of regret, but threats of divine vengeance against anyone who dared to interfere with her sacred mission. She proclaimed herself to be an instrument of God's will, chosen to punish slaves who rebelled against their divinely ordained bondage, and she promised that her death would only encourage others to continue her holy work. Freeman's response was calm and methodical, delivered in the tone of someone conducting a formal interrogation rather than engaging in emotional confrontation. He identified himself as a representative of the Underground Railroad network and informed Kate that her reign of terror had ended permanently. He then began asking specific questions about her methods, motivations, and the location of evidence that might help identify additional victims whose bodies had not yet been discovered. Kate's answers, delivered with the arrogant confidence of someone who believed herself beyond human judgment, provided Freeman with detailed information about murders that had never been officially reported. She boasted about victims whose disappearances had been attributed to other causes, described hunting techniques that revealed the true scope of her activities, and expressed regret only that her death would prevent her from continuing what she saw as necessary and righteous work. The interrogation lasted nearly 30 minutes, during which Kate's condition steadily deteriorated, despite her extraordinary constitution. Blood loss from multiple wounds was taking its inevitable toll, and her breathing became increasingly labored as damaged lungs struggled to function. But her mental faculties remained sharp until the very end, and she continued providing information with the matter-of-fact precision of someone discussing route in business matters. Kate's final words, spoken as her breathing became too shallow to support further conversation, were a detailed description of the trophy collection. Hidden beneath her plantation house, she provided explicit directions to the concealed cellar where she had stored mementos from each murder, apparently wanting to ensure that her accomplishments would be properly documented and remembered. Her last coherent statement was an expression of satisfaction that she had successfully avenged her husband's death by killing far more slaves than the two who had actually been responsible for his death. Freeman's team spent the remainder of the day searching the Bender plantation and recovering evidence that confirmed the full scope of Kate's activities. The hidden cellar contained a collection of personal effects, clothing fragments, and preserved body parts that represented at least 43 individual victims, nearly twice the number that had been officially attributed to the mysterious killer. Each item was carefully catalogued and labeled, suggesting that Kate had maintained detailed records of her murders with the same methodical precision that characterized her hunting techniques. The discovery of Kate's journal provided the most disturbing insights into her psychological evolution from grieving widow to serial killer. The entries revealed a mind that had progressed through various stages of rationalization and self-justification before arriving at a belief system that portrayed mass murder as both necessary and holy. The journal's final entries, written just days before her death, described elaborate plans for expanding her hunting territory and recruiting other whites to assist in what she saw as a sacred mission to eliminate slave rebellion throughout Virginia. Freeman's team spent 3 additional days documenting the evidence and preparing detailed reports for Underground Railroad leaders and sympathetic authorities who might be able to ensure that Kate's crimes received appropriate attention. They also conducted a systematic search of Kate's known hunting territory using information from her journal to locate additional bodies that had not been previously discovered. The final body count reached 47,000 confirmed victims, making Kate Bender one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The victims ranged in age from 8 to 63 and included entire families as well as individual escapees. The methodical nature of the murders, combined with their theological staging and Kate's obvious enjoyment of the psychological torture that preceded death, placed her crimes in a category of evil that defied contemporary understanding of human behavior. Freeman's report on the Kate Bender case was distributed throughout underground railroad networks and abolition organizations, providing detailed warnings about the techniques that bounty hunters and slave catchers might employ against escaped slaves. The report also included tactical recommendations for avoiding detection and defending against predatory individuals who might target underground railroad operations in the future. But perhaps the most significant impact of Kate's death was psychological rather than tactical. The successful elimination of the demon of Henrico County demonstrated that even the most feared and seemingly supernatural enemies could be defeated by careful planning, professional competence, and coordinated action. The myth of Kate's invincibility, which had paralyzed Underground Railroad operations throughout Central Virginia, was permanently shattered by the reality of her corpse lying in a forest clearing with multiple bullet wounds. Kate Bender died as she had lived through violence. Her massive body lay still in the forest clearing. The same hands that had strangled 47 innocent people now motionless in the Virginia dirt. The woman who had terrorized an entire region for nearly 2 years, who had single-handedly crippled the Underground Railroad through Central Virginia, was finally silent. Freeman's team worked quickly to dispose of Kate's remains. Understanding that leaving evidence of their involvement would create complications none of them could afford, they buried her body in an unmarked grave deep in the forest she had claimed as her hunting ground, ensuring that no monument would ever mark the resting place of Virginia's most prolific killer. The Bender plantation house was abandoned shortly afterward, its dark secrets sealed beneath overgrown vegetation and crumbling walls. Local residents avoided the property, claiming it was cursed, though few knew the full extent of the horrors that had been planned within its walls. Within a decade, the forest had reclaimed the buildings entirely, erasing the last physical traces of Kate Bender's existence. Official records of the case were minimal and deliberately vague. Constable Whitfield filed reports suggesting that the mysterious killer had simply disappeared, possibly moving to another region or dying of natural causes. The truth about Kate's identity and Freeman's operation remained hidden, known only to a small circle of Underground Railroad operatives who understood the importance of keeping such dangerous knowledge secret. But the impact of Kate's campaign could not be so easily erased. The Underground Railroad routes through Central Virginia remained largely abandoned for years after her death. As word of the forest demon continued to circulate through slave communities long after the actual threat had ended, the psychological scars left by her reign of terror prove more durable than her physical presence. A testament to the devastating effectiveness of her methods. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Henrico County finally comes to an end. If this story gave you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. What do you think of Kate Bender's story? Could such systematic evil really have existed in early America? Let's discover together in the comments below. The story of Kate Bender forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. That ordinary people, given the right circumstances and motivations, are capable of extraordinary evil. Kate was not born a monster. She was created by a system that dehumanized an entire race of people, by personal trauma that she allowed to consume her humanity, and by a society that looked the other way when violence served its interests. Her crimes remind us that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs. It often wears the mask of respectability, attends church on Sunday mornings, and participates in normal social activities while planning unspeakable acts in private. The most dangerous predators are not the obviously deranged individuals we can easily identify and avoid, but the ones who walk among us undetected, hiding their true nature behind carefully constructed facades. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Kate Bender's story shows us how quickly civilization can break down when we stop seeing other human beings as truly human. Once that fundamental recognition is lost, once we begin viewing others as less than ourselves, there are no limits to the cruelty we can justify in our own minds. This mystery shows us that the capacity for both good and evil exists within every human heart, and that the choices we make in moments of crisis reveal who we truly are. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do darker secrets still lie buried in the Virginia forests? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video.